All right. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I know like everyone's busy, so setting aside time for a webinar I'm very appreciative that you're here. Um, so I wanted to just start by saying like this is the beginning of a series that I'm going to be doing. And this one I'm just doing solo because I wanted to kind of kick it off with offering some just different ideas as to how you might improve your work life situation, workplace resilience, how to pursue success without burning out. The why should we have to sacrifice our health and well-being in order to be successful, right? We shouldn't. So that's kind of the overarching theme of the series. And so in the future, I'm going to have guests who are going to come speak to that too and add their own 2 cents so that you'll have, a lot more value going forward. So anyway, welcome again. I'm really appreciative that you're here. Um, so first things first, I just wanted to invite you to just see if you can tune out what you just left behind. Just kind of see if you can kind of settle down a little bit, allow yourself to just quiet your mind. That'll make this go a little bit better for you in terms of maybe receiving something new, a new insight. So I know you probably came from a busy day. So if you can just kind of take a minute, take a breath, see if you can be present, and whatever you left behind is going to be waiting for you when you get out. I don't mean that in a scary way. I mean that as you can be here now. Um, so first off, if you want to type in the chat, like if there was anything particular that brought you here today, anything that you're, you know, struggling with or just interested in, anything that piqued your interest, feel free to do that because definitely would like to, uh, if there is something like that, would like to address it through the call. And if not, just sit back and relax. So one question I just want to ask is, would you like to be at your best regardless of what's going on in your life? Meaning circumstances happen, right? Life happens. Like maybe it's a lot of deadlines. Maybe it's there are layoffs happening at your business. Maybe you're having stuff in your personal life going on that's really kind of seeping into your work life, or vice versa. And so the question is like, what if you could be at your best even with all this life stuff happening? You is that something you would like? So that's what I'm hoping to offer you here today, or at least give you a taste of it. Um, so just to set the stage a little bit, I don't know if you are familiar with the term VUCA. It's an acronym. It stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This is a term that was coined in the late 80s, but really started being used more in the early 20th century. And what it was sort of pointing to is that we're in this new kind of stage of business, economy, just and even the political stage, right? Everything seems very stirred up. At least in the 20th century, it seemed like there was a sort of, at least when it came to career and work, there was some predictability. People had this sense of being able to work at a company for 40 years and then you'd have a pension, you'd have like a solid retirement at the end of that. There was sort of a linear, stable path you could take. And then towards the end of the 20th century, that stopped being true. And, our parents and grandparents didn't really prepare us for this new world. Their whole thing was just work hard and you'll be successful and you'll have financial stability. And that doesn't necessarily apply anymore. A lot of us do work really hard, but that doesn't account for then being laid off from a job and then having to look for something new, or it doesn't account for finding yourself in a company that you thought was going to be great, but it turns out there's all this upheaval and or chaos and or pressure, unrealistic demands and things like that. So we really weren't prepared by the people who came before us for this VUCA world. So how do we show up and how can we be our best without walking around with like a low grade anxiety all the time? I mean, that's a lot of people are really walking around in this kind of anxious state. I would even use the word dysregulated because at least what I notice is that over the past few years, people seem more irritable, agitated, shorter fuses than in general than it used to be. So this is what I'm noticing. And so, but we're kind of trying to apply this, I'd say, outdated playbook, right? This kind of linear path playbook of, A plus B leads to Z, happy ending, success, fulfillment, happiness, and then your happy retirement at the end of it all. So we're not in that world anymore. So we need to create a new playbook, right? So that's kind of part of what this is all about. Um, so just to pivot a little bit, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own experience just in the work world, my own kind of career path, and how that sort of ties into the VUCA situation and a lot of clients that I've been working with who have similar but different struggles. So um, my first career was struggle, but that was because I was also trying to be an actor. So that's a whole other thing. And you could say like, well, you kind of chose that struggle, which I did. But there was something that I realized later on in life, which is that I actually identified with struggle. Like struggle was kind of part of my identity. So even after I left the struggle of the acting career and went on to another career, struggle seemed to follow me. It never seemed easy for me to sort of get my footing. So I went back to graduate school to get a degree so I could become a counselor and then a therapist. And, you know, I happened to be graduating right as the 2008 crisis was unfolding, right? So this was like a terrible time to be coming onto the job market. So, there was this part of me that was kind of like, well, of course, this is kind of how it goes for me. I wasn't accounting for this just volatility and uncertainty that was just happening for everyone. I mean, obviously it wasn't just about me, but I was also saying, but like, why is it that this is my luck? There's a little bit of a victim mindset happening. So I graduated. Fortunately, I did find a job. There weren't a lot of jobs out there, but you could get a job at the public hospital in New York City, okay, because they had huge turnover because it was chaotic and kind of crazy. So I got a job there, and but it was a very intense place to work. I mean, it was chaotic as most hospitals are, but it was also under-resourced. So, it was a lot of, just a lower socioeconomic group of clients. And so the hospital itself, was running on empty and expecting the impossible from the staff. So most everybody there was either burnt out or burning out because it was just too much. Um, the higher ups were also putting a lot of pressure on the staff, again, to do the impossible. But then there was not the support that we needed. So, my supervisors, for example, my direct supervisors, they were so burnt out. They'd been working there probably 20, 30 years that I could never find them. I had something I needed help with. They weren't even there. So it was like top down pressure, no support. So within a year, I had completely burnt out. I mean, I was having panic attacks. I was, just couldn't sleep. The anxiety was just very high. And so I was starting to having health symptoms, health issues, and I realized I could not stay there. But again, with the fallout of the 2008 crisis, and so I mean, a lot of companies were on hiring freezes. So I ended up quitting the job because I just couldn't stay. It just wasn't, it was going to kill me basically if I stayed there. Got a temp job, and I was working at a kind of just to recover, low paying temp job, but then that ended, and then I ended up unemployed. So I'm just kind of bringing this up to illustrate a couple of things. One is that, if you've ever been at a company where, and it may not be healthcare, which is its own kind of brand of chaos, but if you've ever been in a company that was chaotic, stressful, impossible demands, I've been there, right? So I know what that's like. The other thing is I also have understood what's like to be unemployed and how stressful that is and how that can be its own sort of burnout situation, just trying to find a job, especially in a really scary economic environment. So I've been there, and then that's kind of like what's happening, right? That's the circumstances. Those are the circumstances. And then there's this struggle piece that I'm bringing with me, which is part of my identity. And it's, again, there's a little victimy thing going on in there. So it's like everything is hard. Of course it is. That's how I see it. And, the cup is half empty. And that starts creating this whole series of narratives in my head. Never going to get it right. Why can't I get things right? Why is this my luck, etc.? So, bringing that up just to talk a little bit about this relationship between the environment and what we're bringing to it, like our internal life, our internal world that we're bringing to this world, which again, I'm going to call the VUCA world. So, um, there was a turning point though that happened, right? So I'm in the world of personal development. I have been even before I started working in it. So I've always been looking for, is there something, that's really helpful, for myself, of course, and for other people. I mean, I went into this field of mental health because I wanted to help myself and I wanted to help others. I wanted to help people stop suffering or suffer less. So I've been searching, like I've looked at in so many different directions, Western psychotherapy, um, Eastern philosophy, and a lot of other different things as well. I'm always looking. And so I stumbled upon this emerging school of thought, this emerging field. And this school of thought really struck me because suddenly all the pieces that I'd sort of found throughout my search all seemed to kind of fit together. They all seemed to land in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And I started to have all sorts of insights about, you know, yes, this environment had been difficult, but also I was bringing a certain worldview, you could call it, to this, and that was creating my reality. So I just want to talk a little bit about it. Like there's sort of three basic principles that apply to the situation that can help, like if you're going through whatever you're going through, like whether it's work related or something else, because there's a couple of ways that we can look at this, and I'm going to try to illustrate it succinctly because that's hard sometimes, but to hopefully give you a sense of like what the turning point was, what the insights were. So the first piece is this kind of our inner world, right? Which we all know we have an inner world, but a lot of us don't know exactly how pervasive our reality is in terms of how we might be creating certain situations, certain I'd call them weather patterns. Weather patterns happen, like we don't make them happen. But are we paying more attention to the storm that's happening over here? Or are we able to see the sun coming through the trees? Like what are we paying attention to in these weather patterns? The other thing about it though is that a lot of our internal world is kind of invisible to us because we walk around in it all day long. It's like the fish swimming in water. A fish isn't thinking about how it's swimming in water. It just is. And so I started to see that struggle was actually the water I was swimming in. I was swimming in this water of struggle, and I didn't think I didn't really realize how much I was doing that, or how much I was sort of adding to it, how much I was sort of keeping it alive, keeping that story alive. So when I started to see that, oh, struggle is just like the weather in my mind that I'm kind of like always paying attention to. I'm not actually noticing that, oh, the sun is shining over there. If I just look in that direction, I'm always looking at the struggle. So I started to become more aware of that. And that really started to break some things open. So, there's a couple things about that. One, the weather patterns that, weather happens. We can't control our moods. We can't control our emotions, but we can control sort of like the relationships that we have with those things. Like, if we have a bad mood, does that mean, oh, the world is ending, or like, oh, life sucks? Or the same thing with, if something is going badly at work, oh, this job is terrible. Um, but the other thing about it is like we all have these kind of settings we get stuck on. Mine was struggle. A lot of the people I work with, it's like survival mode, or it's overwhelm, or it's chronic stress, or maybe it's dissatisfaction, or maybe it's scarcity. Like there's never enough time, there's never enough money, maybe it's that. So we all have norms. They're not always negative, right? Like, but sometimes when it comes to work, we might get stuck on a negative setting. And maybe it has to do with certain people, or maybe it has to do with a certain department, or maybe it has to do with a certain project. But the invitation is to kind of just be curious about that. Like, do you have certain norms you get stuck on, certain settings that you pay more attention to? So the other thing about that is just that these environments themselves also have a weather system. If you think about a lot of companies and this feeling of always like it's always a crisis, like either is like the company is always in crisis and everything's life and death, and like there's so much just intensity and urgency, and that is how a lot of it seems like American companies at least operate. And it's also worthwhile to question that too, because sometimes I'd say 99% of the time, it's not necessary, it's not warranted. There's not actually an emergency happening. But this is the weather in people's minds creating an environment that everyone else is then internalizing. So, to be curious about your own settings, your own internal weather, but also like, is it something that you actually have to buy into? Because sometimes it seems like there's a choice and sometimes it seems like there's not. And a lot of times it feels like there's not. But, to begin to question that. So that's kind of the first point I just want to make is just to kind of like about really kind of just starting to be aware of anything you might be bringing to a situation, because oftentimes it feels like we're just kind of being acted on by the environment and we're just struggling to deal with it. But the question is there something that you're bringing? So I just want to stop for a minute just to see if there's any questions about anything I've said so far. If there is, you can feel free to put it in the chat. And I just want to say in general, you can put any questions at any time or any comments you have in the chat, because at any point where I'm talking, you might have a comment or a question. And I didn't say that before, but feel free to put anything in the chat. So just want to check, Nicole, are there any questions in there at this point?
No questions, or actually, no questions, but Bridget loves the weather analogy, as do I.
Awesome. Yeah, it's just something again to be curious about, like your relationship with your own weather. And like, are you paying more attention to certain weather than others? Are you always waiting? Like, are you always wondering, like, when is the sun going to come out? Why is it not coming out enough? Or are you kind of okay with how the fluctuations happen? So that's kind of just, noticing if you're, what kind of water you might be swimming in. And if there's something that might have been invisible to you in the past. So the second point is really it's more about our relationship to our thoughts. I mean, that's about also the weather is about our relationship to our sort of moods and our internal state. And then there's like our thoughts, the thoughts that come into our head. So in the West, and I would say this is kind of something that, well, I'll just start talking about it, which is that in the West, we have really been conditioned to think that our intellect and our rational mind is really where our power is. You've heard knowledge is power, but also just in general, like from the time we're 5 years old, right? We're in the formal education system, we're being oriented into our intellect. We're being taught to problem solve that way. We're being taught to sharpen our intellect, and that's all great. That's all wonderful, except that the intellect has amazing abilities, right? But it's also can be limited when it comes to trying to solve the bigger problems in life. Like it's great for making plans, it's great for analysis, it's great for I mean a number of things, right? Again, but when it comes to actually solving the problem, like, well, how do I find happiness? Or even like, why isn't my career working out for me? The intellect is really useless. But the problem is because we've been trained to really filter so much through our intellect, we're often trying to solve our problems through the intellect. And it just doesn't work. I mean, you've heard I think you've heard the term analysis paralysis, right? Like analyzing things to death. And that's what we find ourselves doing a lot of things. We overthink, we overplan. And I say this as a Western problem, specifically Western first world, probably dating back specifically to the Enlightenment period in Europe, right? When the rational mind was exalted and everybody was like, yes, it's all about reason. But other cultures, they actually understand that there's value in other states of mind, other modes of consciousness. One obvious example is, Buddhist meditation, Zen meditation. It's a very different mode of consciousness, but it's also, you could argue that if you want peace or happiness, you're more likely to find it in meditation than you are to find it in your intellect. In fact, I would say it doesn't exist in your intellect at all. Things like freedom, peace, these kind of these less concrete things, they exist in other states of consciousness, and we're trying to find them oftentimes through intellectual functioning. Now, how does this relate to work? Well, there are states of mind that we can be using at work too, but because that could actually make work easier and give us more of a sense of well-being while we're working. But again, we're usually in our heads most of the time, so we're not doing that. But, flow states, being in the zone, even like meditative states, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be sitting in the lotus position with your eyes closed. A meditative state is really just a state in which you're more in a more receptive, observing state, distancing from your intellect, from your intellectual thinking. So when we learn to actually tap into these other modes of consciousness, states of mind, what we often find is that there is a lot more, many more resources there than we thought. And not only that, but I'd say like we're more likely to get creative solutions and insights and answers to our problems from this space than we are from analyzing and grinding in our intellect. Now, this is oftentimes hard for Westerners to hear because they're really, really identified with the intellect. Again, we've been trained to live there. We've been trained that that's the place we want to go for answers. But what I'm saying is that it's actually not true. It has its uses, but it's very important to know when to engage in the intellect and when to put it down. And more often than not, putting it down is going to be more beneficial. So learning to shift out of the intellect and into these other modes of thought it's like changing the channel, but because we're not used to doing it, sometimes we don't know how to do it. Right. So, but if you've ever meditated, I mean, or been in the zone, then you know that it's possible, right? You know it's possible to kind of relax your mind and detach from the noise that's going on up there. It's kind of like, but I'd say again, for people who are used to, most of us who are used to being in our heads a lot, it's kind of like riding a bike. At first you're like, oh shoot, I'm in my head again. You have to learn how to relax and start tapping into these other, it's like intuition. You could call it the intuitive body, learning to, quiet your mind so that you can be receptive to what's coming to you. Now, the big piece about this is that you have to be present. You can't be thinking about the past. You can't be trying to plan for the future in order to access what I would call your deeper intelligence. or, your sort of intuition or your innate wisdom. Sadly, again, we've been trained away from listening to our intuition. The intuition has been devalued, right? These other kinds of modes of consciousness that other cultures use, they're not given any kind of importance here. I mean, we get a little bit of the influence with of the Eastern influence with meditation has become very popular. But it's kind of been used as this sort of like self-care tool where, you go meditate for 20 minutes, but then you get back in your head and you go about your day. And so nothing really changes in a lasting way. So what I'm talking about is a different way of operating. It's like operating from a different part of your mind. So I just want to stop for a second and see if anything this is landing, or if there's any questions that anyone have at this point. Uh,
I would just agree it's landing, Ruth. It's like you schedule a massage, but the place is 45 minutes away and then you're driving home through traffic. So it just
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and so this is the thing where we're used to living in this sort of intellect stress response situation. And and the thing about, again, living in our heads, which is where we oriented to live, is that we're trying to do our problem solving there, or we're trying to do all our planning, our to-do lists, we're trying to solve our big life questions, and then we're getting stressed out about it. And like you're saying, you go to get the massage thinking, I got to take the edge off. But because the whole way we're operating is not working, it doesn't really help. I mean, it helps for a minute. I'm all about massage, but then we jump right back into the old ways of operating. So the next point is really about how do we switch into, how do we shift into this other state of mind? And um, one important thing is learning really not to take anything that the narrator is saying very seriously. So, we have this intellect. It's the intellect. I could also call it the narrator. I'd call it the conditioned mind. There's a lot of ways you could describe it. But it really is the chatterbox that's going off in our brain all the time, right? And it doesn't usually have anything useful to say, because once you learn, and if you have ever sat in meditation, or if you've but you don't have to sit in meditation, right? You can sit and people watch. You can sit and, you can be playing with your child or your pet. And what that does is it takes you out of your head and it puts you in a more present state of mind. And so that's the exercise, is to learn how and when you get out of your head, and when you find yourself in these more resourceful states of mind. So once you learn how to tune in more and you start to notice the insights coming, and you start to connect the dots, like, oh, the insights actually don't come when I'm in my head, listening to the narrator up there, or stressing myself out about my to-do list, or asking questions of myself like, why aren't you more successful? Why haven't you done this today? Why haven't you done this today? Once you were like able to stop paying attention to that weather pattern, that's like the kind of like constant, churning that's going on. And you learn to drop into, again, you could call it your intuitive body, or you could call it your deeper intelligence. You learn to trust that, and then you realize you don't need, this noise is burning you out, and you don't need it. And you can operate from this more present-centered, receptive space. And the good news about this, the incredible news about this, is that it's this replenishing reservoir, right? Like, so your great ideas, your brilliance, your resourcefulness, it's always showing up, but from this deeper place. And of course, the catch is, like, it's showing up in the present. It's only showing up when you need it, or it's only showing up, here and now. Not by looking at the past, and not by trying to plan for the future. So, for example, a lot. I mean, I think a lot of people are trying to, like, constantly, anxiously trying to prepare for what might be coming. Could anyone have prepared for a lockdown in 2020? No. But what did we do? We responded, right? Like, that was like everyone responded. And sometimes some people lost their businesses, and some people, had to like move their schooling and their job home at once. But everybody responded in the moment, and everyone got ideas and insights. Some people got amazing insights about how to do that, but we all figured it out in the moment. We could never have prepared for it. So it's about developing this trust, right? Trust in our deeper wisdom, and also learning that what's happening up here is usually leading us astray. Ooh, excuse me. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about sustainable success. Sustainable success is actually realizing that you don't have to push so hard. You don't have to be forcing and pushing. And a lot of that drive comes from here, like this idea that we need to be pushing and forcing, and that we also need to be stressed out. Maybe we don't need to be stressed out if we're actually living in the present, listening more to our moment to moment insights. Then we don't need to be so stressed out. We don't need to be planning so much. We don't need to be like, trying to like hold so much in our minds, in our heads. And it's just a much more an easier way to live. And the other thing is, like, I know you've probably seen people, like if you watch someone who's like really in their heads, like walking around, and you can see that they're like not aware of like what's happening right in their lives. So they're also missing, not only are they missing like the great parts of life, right? Like connection with others, but they're also missing opportunities because they're so blocked. They're so blocked by what's going on in their minds. But we all do that to some degree, right? Like we all kind of get stuck in our heads about some things, or again, we get stuck on this weather setting, so that like we're missing maybe what's happening over here. There's an opportunity here, but because we're kind of stuck on this setting, we're not seeing that. So what I'm pointing to is just, it's kind of like again, dropping out of the head and having a bit of a more expansive view of what's possible, like outside of what we have considered reality and what has been given to us as reality, and the reality that we have created through our experiences and the meaning that we make out of our own thoughts, out of our own experiences, and even out of our circumstances that are happening. So that's kind of like, and just in terms of my own story, it's like I used to, again, be stuck on this struggle setting. And I used to think a lot about figuring out my life. Like, I got to figure out my life. It was this whole like, did I ever figure out my life? No. I mean, I didn't figure it out intellectually. The minute I stopped figuring it out, it started to happen. It started unfolding in an easier way. Things showed up, people showed up, and I went with it, right? That's really living in this more kind of flow way, as opposed to trying to plan everything out and have the perfect goals set and all of that. And the thing about the VUCA world is that we can't control it, right? And so the illusion of the intellect is that it thinks it has control. It thinks it can control things. It thinks if it plans enough or creates the right goals or the right self-care regimen, it thinks if it has the right schedule, then everything's going to be fine. But I've never seen anyone be able to create the perfect workout regimen and self-care schedule and feel any better than anyone else, because that's not how it works. It happens from this deeper place, this more intuitive place. So that's sort of it. Just, and in a nutshell, I'm going to have a couple of just thought exercises to offer you. But just at this point, I want to see if there's any questions. Any questions, Nicole, in the chat?
Not questions per se. Oh, do you have any recommendations or resources we can refer to, like for how to tap out of intellect and more into like the intuitive flow state?
Okay. Yeah, I will offer some of those for sure. Cool.
Thanks.
And then first I'll take you through it's not take you through, but just want to offer a couple of little thought exercises. So the first one is think about when you get your best ideas. Like for a lot of people, it's like in the shower or when they're exercising or when they're doing their chores, things like that. So, it's very, I would say rarely, if ever, when they're analyzing, because it's usually or overthinking, right? So if you think about that, like that's kind of like a first step towards accessing what I'm talking about. I mean, not that you don't know what I'm talking about, but what I'm saying is like if you're kind of wondering how to practice it or apply it in your day, that would be one way to do it. Is like most people have a time or a place, right? Where they realize sometimes it's like, oh yeah, when I'm out jogging, that's when I always get this like rush of creative insights. Or, again, when taking a walk or in the shower. And so it's not that you necessarily are going to go into the shower and try to get your ideas, because that's the opposite of what I'm talking about. So it's really illustrating that it's when your mind relaxes and stops thinking so hard that this kind of reservoir has a chance to open up. And so it's really about finding ways to be more in a meditative state, or more in a receptive state, or more in a dreaming state. I mean, Albert Einstein used to talk about daydreaming all the time. He thought, I mean, there was a story about the theory of relativity. Apparently, he used to daydream on purpose all the time because he believed that the intuition was really where the genius was. And that he came up with the theory of relativity out of a daydream. So, maybe there's something to it. Maybe there's something to it. So yeah, swimming. Yeah, swimming is that's a great one, because that talk about meditative, being in the water. In fact, one of my colleagues will talk about that. She says, she and her business partner, they actually are both also relationship partner. But she said whenever one of them starts to get too like tight in the head, she'll say, "We need to go take a swim. Like, let's go take a swim." And they'll go take a swim for half an hour. And then whether they get the insights during the swim or after the swim, it enables them to clear their heads, so they're able to kind of again get back in more of a relaxed state. Being stressed out is not productive. It's really not. And yet we have this whole work culture that keeps people stressed out, right? So that they're like not clear headed. They're not getting their best ideas. They're living in fear. It's a little counterintuitive, if you ask me. So, um, the other little thought exercise is, if you just, I mentioned the pandemic, which was kind of like, something we couldn't have predicted, but just to think about a time or times when you were in some kind of a jam, or, like you didn't, there was a problem that just seemed like you didn't know the way out of. To think about that and think about how the solution came to you, or it could be something like, an emergency situation, like, and how you responded in that situation. Because obviously, if you're here today, you have been through a lot in life and you had to rise to the occasion. You had to come up with some solutions. We all do that on a regular basis, but we're not always paying attention to how this works, right? We don't really think about it. We don't pay attention to it. It's like, oh, yeah, I had this problem. We think that we're, problem solving and finding the solution, but it's usually less about that at all. Usually when we're not thinking, or when we're like kind of, we have to act because life has presented us with a situation we have to act on quickly. We rise to the occasion. And that's part of what I'm talking about, is trusting, being able to trust that we can rise to the occasion, that we're going to get the solutions that we need when we need them. Probably not a minute before, but in the moment. So those are just a couple of things to just sort of think about as you go through your week. Like, when do I get my best ideas? Or notice, like, after you have an insight, what you were doing. Like, if you've been struggling with a problem and maybe you get the solution, it comes to you. What were you doing when that happened? So it's a little bit about connecting the dots here. And when you start to notice when when you're at your best, which again doesn't necessarily mean when you're thinking your best, but it means like when you're feeling the best and when you're performing your best, what's happening? What's you know, what are you doing? What's going on? How did you get there? So that's yeah, so I'm gonna see if there are any questions in a minute, but before I do that, I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that I'm offering to a little bit of a deep dive on this topic here. And so in case you want to know more how to apply this to your own work, business, life in general, any of those things, because it's kind of it can be a lot when I'm sort of, talking and just trying to get the information out. But the deep dive I'm doing is 3 sessions. It's going to be let me see if I have the now I write the dates down. Yeah, October 29th, November 12th, and November 19th. That's Tuesday, and it's going to be Tuesdays at 12 p.m. for those 3 dates. So I'm going to go through these principles more deeply and then also provide laser coaching for people so that you can apply it to your life, so it's not just kind of ideas that you're taking in, but just seeing like, how does this actually work in your day-to-day life? How can it actually bring you more freedom, more peace, and to enjoy this work-life journey that we're on more? So it can be less of a struggle and a grind, more enjoyable, less stressful. So that's going to be those dates, October 29th, November 12th, and November 19th at 12 p.m. Nicole is putting the link in the chat. Yes. So if you want to check that out, you can go check that out in the chat. And in general, if you want more general resources, I have a community of resources that I've set up, which is available. And I'm going to be hosting monthly, I'm going to call them happy hours. Bring your mocktail, BYO mocktail. And those are going to be on Thursdays at 6 p.m. And so each month I'll have a different topic. So related to not necessarily work life and resilience and work life, but it's going to be loosely around that. But you can also, anyone can bring any topic that they want to talk about, because it's going to be an open discussion, but again, on how to apply these principles in order to make life easier and more enjoyable. So that's also, Nicole is putting that link in the chat as well, so you can check that out. And then, for those of you who are watching the replay, I will send this link along with it, these links along with it, so you can access those as well. So now I just want to see if there's any questions, any further questions, comments, anything that anyone has before we call it a day. Yeah, and also if you don't have a question, that's fine too. So, because it's been a pleasure. I'm glad you were able to join me today. Yes, thank you too. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. All right. Well, I will let you go back to your life, and I hope that you can bring a little bit of, maybe a little bit of that sort of deeper resonance with you. See if some of that can help you get through the day a little bit more easily. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.